Page 248 continued. Works. Para. At the outset of our study of Tennyson's works, it may be well to record two things by way of suggestion. First, Tennyson's poetry is not so much to be studied as to be read and appreciated. He is a poet to have open on one's table and to enjoy as one enjoys his daily exercise. And second, we should by all means begin to get acquainted with Tennyson in the days of our youth. Unlike Browning, who is generally appreciated by more mature minds, Tennyson is for enjoyment, for inspiration, rather than for instruction. Only youth can fully appreciate him, and youth, unfortunately, except in a few rare, beautiful cases, is something which does not dwell with us long after our school days. The secret of poetry, especially of Tennyson's poetry, is to be eternally young, and like Adam in paradise, to find every morning a new world, fresh, wonderful, inspiring, as if just from the hands of God. Para. Except by the student eager to understand the whole range of poetry in this age, Tennyson's earlier poems and his later dramas may well be omitted. Opinions vary about both, but the general judgment seems to be that the earlier poems show too much of Byron's influence, and their crudeness suffers by comparison with the exquisitely finished work of Tennyson's middle life. Of dramatic works, he wrote 7, his great ambition being to present a large part of the history of, quote, England in a series of dramas. Stop. Becket was one of the best of these works and met with considerable favor on the stage. But, like all the others, it indicates that Tennyson lacked the dramatic power and the humor necessary for a successful playwright. Stop, but there is no unquote mark. Para. Among the remaining poems, there is such a wide variety that every reader must be left largely to follow his own delightful choice. Of the poems of 1842, we have already mentioned those best worth reading. The Princess, a medley, medley, 1847, a long poem of over 3,000 lines of blank verse, is Tennyson's answer to the question of woman's rights and woman's sphere, which was then, as in our own day, strongly agitating the public mind. In this poem, a baby finally solves the problem which philosophers have pondered ever since men began to think connectedly about human society. Page 249. A few exquisite songs like Tears, Idle Tears, Bugle Song, and Sweet and Low form the most delightful part of this poem, which in general is hardly up to the standard of the poet's later work. Stop. Maud, M-A-U-D, 1855, is what is called in literature a monodrama, telling the story of a lover who passes from morbidness to ecstasy, then to anger and murder, followed by insanity and recovery. This was Tennyson's favorite, and among his friends he read aloud from it more than from any other poem. Perhaps if we could hear Tennyson read it, we should appreciate it better. But on the whole, it seems overwrought, W-R-O-U-G-H-T, and melodramatic. If its lyrics like, quote, come into the garden, Maud, unquote, which make this work a favorite with young lovers, are characterized by, quote, prettiness, unquote, rather than by beauty or strength. Para. Perhaps the most loved of all Tennyson's works is in memoriam, which on account of both its theme and its exquisite workmanship is, quote, one of the few immortal names that were not born to die, unquote, stop. The immediate occasion of this remarkable poem was Tennyson's profound personal grief at the death of his friend Hallam, Hallam. As he wrote lyric after lyric inspired by this sad subject, the poet's grief became less personal, and the greater grief of humanity, mourning for its dead and questioning its immortality, took possession of him. Gradually the poem became an expression first of universal doubt and then of universal faith, a faith which rests ultimately not on reason or philosophy but on the soul's instinct for immortality. The immortality of human love is the theme of the poem, which is made up of over 100 different lyrics. The movement takes us through 3 years, rising slowly from poignant sorrow and doubt to a calm peace and hope, and ending with a noble hymn of courage and faith, a modest courage and a humble faith, love inspired, which will be a favorite long as saddened men turn to literature for consolation. Though Darwin's greatest books had not yet been written, science had already overturned many old conceptions of life. And Tennyson, who lived apart and thought deeply on all the problems of his day, gave this poem to the world as his own answer to the doubts and questionings of men. This universal human interest, together with its exquisite form and melody, makes the poem, in popular favor at least, the supreme threnody, Thrенody, or elegiac poem of our literature. Though Milton's Lycidas is, from the critical point of view, undoubtedly a more artistic work, para. The Idylls, Idylls, of the King ranks among the greatest of Tennyson's later works. Its general subject is the Celtic, Celtic, legends of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, and the chief source of its material is Mallory's Morte, Morte, Arthur. Stop. Here in this mass of beautiful legends is certainly the subject of a great national epic. Yet after 4,000 years, during which many poets have used the material, the great epic is still unwritten. Milton and Spenser, as we have already noted, considered this material carefully, and Milton alone of all English writers had perhaps the power to use it in a great epic. Tennyson began to use these legends in his Morte d'Arthur, 1842. But the epic idea probably occurred to him later in 1856 when he began, quote, Geraint, Gerint, and Enid, Enid, unquote, and he added the stories of, quote, Vivian, unquote, comma, Elaine, Elaine, quote, unquote, comma, quote, Guinevere, Guine, Vere, unquote, and other heroes and heroines at intervals until, quote, Balin, Blin, unquote, the last of the Idylls, appeared in 1885. Later, these works were gathered together and arranged with an attempt at unity. The result is in no sense an epic poem, but rather a series of single poems loosely connected by a thread of interest in Arthur, the central personage, and in his unsuccessful attempt to found an ideal kingdom. Para. Entirely different in spirit is another collection of poems called English Idylls, which began in the poems of 1842 and which Tennyson intended should reflect the ideals of widely different types of English life. Of these varied poems, quote, Dora, unquote, quote, the gardener's daughter, unquote, comma, quote, Ulysses, comma, unquote, Locksley, Locksley Hall, unquote, and quote, Sir Galahad, unquote, are the best. But all are worthy of study. One of the most famous of this series is, quote, Enoch Arden, unquote, 1864, in which Tennyson turns from medieval king knights, Knights, in which Tennyson turns medieval knights, Knights, comma, from lords, heroes, and fair ladies to find the material for true poetry among the lowly people that make up the bulk of English life. Its rare melody, its sympathy for common life, and its revelation of the beauty and heroism which hide in humble men and women everywhere made this work an instant favorite. Judged by its sales alone, it was the most popular of his works during the poet's lifetime. Para. Tennyson's later volumes like the Ballads 1880 and Demeter, Demeter 1889, should not be overlooked since they contain some of his best work. The former contains stirring war songs, comma, like, quote, the defense of Lucknow, unquote, and pictures of wild, passionate grief, comma, like, page 250, quote, Rizpah, Rizpah, unquote, semicolon. The latter is notable for, quote, Romney's Remorse, unquote, comma, a wonderful piece of work, semicolon, quote, Merlin and the Gleam, unquote, which expresses the poet's lifelong ideal, and several exquisite little songs like, quote, the Throstle, Throstle, comma, unquote, and the Oak, quote, the Oak, unquote, which show how marvelously the aged poet retained his youthful freshness and inspiration. Here certainly is variety enough to give us long years of literary enjoyment, and we need hardly mention miscellaneous poems like, quote, the Brook, unquote, and, quote, the Charge of the Light Brigade, unquote, which are known to every schoolboy, and, quote, Wages, unquote, and, quote, the Higher Pantheism, unquote, which should be read by every man who thinks about the old problem of life and death. Characteristic of Tennyson's poetry. If we attempt to sum up the quality of Tennyson as shown in all these works, the task is a difficult one, but three things stand out more or less plainly. First, Tennyson is essentially the artist. No other in his age studied the art of poetry so constantly or with such singleness of purpose, and only Swinburne, Swinburne, rivals him in melody and the perfect finish of his verse. Second, like all the great writers of his age, he is emphatically a teacher, often a leader. In the preceding age, as the result of the turmoil produced by the French Revolution, lawlessness was more or less common, and individuality was the rule in literature. Tennyson's theme, so characteristic of his age, is the reign of order, of law in the physical world, producing evolution, and of law in the spiritual world, working out the perfect man. Stop. In memoriam, Idylls of the King, the Princess, here are three widely different poems. Yet the theme of each, so far as poetry is a kind of spiritual philosophy and weighs its words before it utters them, is the orderly development of law in the natural and in the spiritual world. Stop. Para. This certainly is a new doctrine in poetry, but the message does not end here. Law implies a source, a method, an object. Tennyson, after facing his doubts honestly and manfully, finds law even in the sorrows and losses of humanity. He gives this law an infinite and personal source and finds the supreme purpose of all law to be a revelation of divine love. All earthly love, therefore, becomes an image of the heavenly. What first perhaps attracted readers to Tennyson as to Shakespeare was the character of his women, pure, gentle, refined beings whom we must revere as our Anglo-Saxon forefathers revered the women they loved. Like Browning, the poet had loved one good woman supremely, and her love made clear the meaning of all life. The message goes one step further. Because law and love are in the world, faith is the only reasonable attitude toward life and death, even though we understand them not. Such, in a few words, seems to be Tennyson's whole message and philosophy. Para. If we attempt now to fix Tennyson's permanent place in literature as the result of his life and work, we must apply to him the same test that we applied to Milton and Wordsworth, and indeed to all our great poets, and ask with the German critics, quote, what new things has he said to the world or even to his own country, unquote. The answer is frankly that we do not yet know surely, that we are still too near Tennyson to judge him impersonally. This much, however, is clear. In a marvelously complex age and amid 100 great men, he was regarded as a leader. For a full half-century he was the voice of England, loved and honored as a man and a poet, not simply by a few discerning critics, but by a whole people that do not easily give their allegiance to any one man. And that, for the present, is Tennyson's sufficient eulogy. Para. Love, sex, and social taboos. Tennyson is a representative Victorian in his attitude to love and sex. About these things, Victorians were indeed quite prudish. Even a trivial impropriety of dress, not to speak of the modern quote topless unquote and the quote miniskirt unquote, which in the opinion of the House in the annual debate of the Oxford Union held in 1966, quote, does not go far enough, unquote. Footnote number 1 would send the Victorian martinets into paroxysm of rage. They were indeed very touchy about sex, which they were prone to treat with a hush-hush incommodiousness. Stop. INCOMMODIOUSNEWS. Thackeray, Dickens, George Eliot, and others who were stark realists in everything else did not dare lift the lid off the animality of their characters. They approached the beast of sex gingerly and with gloves on. Tennyson is no exception. In his treatment of love and sex, he has neither the frank conviviality of Fielding, capital F small IELDING, nor the voluptuousness of Marlowe or Spenser, nor the ribaldry of Chaucer of the Miller's Tale. He does not think of love in terms of the Platonic transcendentalism of Shelley, page 251. He does think of it as an earthly passion, but refuses to excoriate, E-X-C-O-R-I-A-T-A, but refuses to excoriate it, not to speak of exploring its interior. Unbridled passion he looks down upon, especially when it is non-conjugal. Such passion would be destructive of social order and has to be viewed as a disintegrating and mischievous force. Too often does he prefer the sermon of rising above one's animality, quote, arise and fly, the reeling fawn, the sensual feast, move upward, working out the beast, and let the ape and tiger die, unquote. para. Tennyson's lovers are always full dressed. They love each other like perfect Victorians and are invariably married. A typical instance is provided by The Lady of Shalott, in which we are introduced to, quote, two young lovers, unquote, walking together in the moonlight. Before the reader should get scandalized, Tennyson reassures him that these lovers were, quote, lately wed, unquote, stop. Marriage and procreation are exalted by Tennyson as the symbols of order and human immortality, but licentiousness is to be curbed as it is symptomatic of disorder.